if you feel traumatized, disturbed, upset, disoriented, saddened by the passing of Chaim Kanievsky, then you're very fortunate. Because if you don't feel disturbed by it, that means you have no clue who he was. And then you have missed something which you could fill in by reading about him. I want to start with certain aspects which are, I think, very important and are less likely to be expressed and described and celebrated. And then I'll add also some observations on more obvious sides of his vast, vast scholarship. I saw an article written by a professor, now I hope I pronounce his name correctly, Yuval Albeshen, I think that's the way he pronounces his name. He had contact with Reb Chaim, and he wrote this article as a eulogy as a fourth-generation secular leftist, who had contact with Reb Chaim several times and remained secular. And he writes that when he first had occasion to go, I don't remember if he explained why he went, he was convinced that here's a person who takes advantage of these hundreds of thousands of followers, and he probably enriches himself at their expense and fools them into thinking that he's special and preys on their ignorance and superstitions. And when he had to go to meet with him, he expected to come into a palatial residence, and he got the address in Bnei Brak, and it's a rundown building in a rundown area, and on the way up to his door, there was a long line of people waiting to see him, and he said they looked like people who were suffering poverty and disappointment and depression, and it looked like they were all waiting to go in. And he was sure that the meeting would cost him dearly. And when the person in charge, who was only a volunteer, was just an ordinary person, it wasn't some slick, associate who could fleece the innocent of their money. And he insisted, no, he doesn't take money to speak to people. And he witnessed Rav Chaim's care and concern for people. And he said, when he left, he looked at people who were leaving the apartment, and he saw them with smiles on their faces, with a spring in their step, with a sense of help and confidence. He said, and poverty, living on what the Jewish agency gave out to new immigrants in the 50s, abject, utter poverty. He was astounded. He was astounded, and he said the fact that he ministers to so many people, he had hundreds of thousands of followers worldwide, hundreds of thousands. Some estimate 1 million. People looked up to him and sought his opinions, sought his rulings, his influence. He said, this secular professor, that if the secular world had this kind of resource available free of charge to unlimited numbers of people who needed that kind of personal investment, caring, help, advice, inspiration, would be a different world. And instead, they have the inspiration of people who've lived utterly superficial lives and whose values aren't lasting values, and who use deceit and low stimulation in order to gain their reputations. Anyway, this acknowledgement from a self-described fourth generation secularist, means that Reb Chaim's influence was not limited only to what we would call the religious world, that he had ability to transcend that world and to reach beyond the limitations of that world. My wife's one of my wife's sons teaches in a school for special needs children. Now it's the custom, not only with Chaim, but with many Gadolim, to bring classes of children when they finish some unit of learning, that the Gadol should test the children and praise them for their accomplishments. And usually he would ask a few questions and get a few answers, and then make a few remarks, and then that would be it. He saw that these children, especially these children, he spoke to each child separately. Each child separately, and took the time. Here's a person who, when people come for him for brachos, would say buha. Because buha is short for bracha v'hatzlacha, and it's shorter than bracha v'hatzlacha. A person who measured seconds in terms of his time. When he saw that these children needed his attention, so he gave them each one individual attention. He also had a sense of humor. I know of two incidents that took place. He has a position that a man should not wear a watch. A watch is really a feminine adornment. It's like wearing women's the things women wear. So someone took another fellow along who had a watch, and he figured that he would avoid criticism by putting it on his opposite hand. Not wearing it the way it's worn by normally by people, so therefore it wouldn't count as wearing a feminine adornment. So Reb Chaim asked the one that he knew, why is he wearing a watch? And this one said, but I put it on the other hand. And he said, wear it on your leg. Sorry. That doesn't get you out of the problem as far as I'm concerned. No. Another time, Or Sameach went to him, as they always did, with their groups of Balabatim who come in from Chutz La'aretz, the mentors' missions. It was the summertime, and after they spoke to them, each one would go by to get a bracha from Reb Chaim. And it happened to be summertime. It was very hot. And of course, there was no air conditioning. So one of the mentors had taken off his jacket, and he was wearing short sleeves. He comes up to Reb Chaim, and he asks him for a bracha, and he says, I give you a bracha that Kodesh Baruch Hu should give you enough money to buy long sleeve shirts. He walked off, devastated. He asked, what do I do now? He said, put on your jacket and go around again. And get a real bracha. But he had no hesitation in stating his opinion, and he wasn't cowed by people with a lot of money or support. It meant absolutely nothing to him. He also was famous for knowing things beyond the normal. I know of one case where a bacha was 30 years old and had been in shidduchim for a long time. Wasn't seeing any progress. Went to Chaim, described the problem. Chaim said to him, your kala isn't born yet. Put yourself in his shoes. Can you imagine how he felt? Your kala isn't born yet? 3 months later, he was engaged to a new convert. She wasn't born yet. When a person becomes a convert, like being reborn. So you hear stories like that, and you realize that things are beyond what we would consider to be the normal. And that means he was a person who related to people, he understood people, and he cared about people. And when you're tough with a person, this is something which modern psychology has almost lost sight of entirely. When you're tough with a person, you're sending him a message. I think you're tough. I think you're good. I think you could do better. And I'm investing in you, that you pick yourself up and move, rather than coddling them where they are and not hurting their feelings and lowering your standards so they won't feel criticized and so forth and so on. That sends the message, you're a failure. You're a nobody. You have no abilities. You're an incompetent that has to be coddled. That's not a good message. Now, in terms of learning, there's no way that any of us can begin to appreciate the level of his learning. Let me just give you some anecdotes to perhaps, like see a candle shining from the top of a mountain and get a glimmer of light. There's a Rav in Manchester, England. I hope he's still there. Simcha Bamberger, who was employed by the Manchester community to say the Daf Yomi. You know what the Daf Yomi is, all of you? Okay, so he says it 3 times a day. That's his full-time profession. They just hired him to do that. I used to go to Manchester often enough, and I used to go to his shir, the 6 a.m. shir. It's called my balabais, but and I used to try to ask questions. After the first couple of times that I was there, if I raised my hand, he would tell me the question that I was going to ask, because he figured out how I think. He figured out what would interest me. He was right every time. I could not budge him. He had total control of Shas. I mean, the whole of the Shas, plus the commentaries, absolute total control. It was impossible to budge him. Other people also tried to push him. Once, one of the people in the group asked him a question. He said to that person, the answer is in your bar mitzvah parsha. Now just think what that means. He remembers who the guy is, whatever his wife is, where the pasuk is, and says, the answer is in your bar mitzvah. But that's not normal. That's, I taught university for 10 years. If I had met a single professor, a single one, with a tenth of that kind of grasp of a subject, I would be more impressed with the university. Nobody has grasp like that of a subject. Nobody. He's not one of the generation's leaders. No, not at all. Outside of Manchester, maybe no one's heard of him. He's not a leader. No, he just knows all of Shas cold, and all the commentaries cold, and he's not a leader. So what must the leader be? Chaim finished every year the whole of the Babylonian Talmud, the whole of the Jerusalem Talmud, all of the Midrashim, the Shulchan Aruch, the Rambam, and I'm leaving out 2 more. Tanakh, and maybe the Torah, I don't know what the other one. I said the Shulchan Aruch. Every year, he made a siyum al kol Torah kula. Made a siyum on, maybe it was a Zohar. It was a Zohar. I study these subjects. Let me not be guilty of false humility, right? I'm not dumb. I was a professor for 10 years. I did publish a book with Oxford University Press. So I guess, I can't dream of that. I study the Shulchan Aruch to my Cherusa. It's hard. Especially we're doing Tarovis, which is considered to be the hardest section. We've been through it now 4 or 5 times. We still struggle. Here's someone who does it every year together with everything else. These he called his chovos, his obligations. He was willing to give out to other people, to treat people with kindness and generosity. But debts are debts, and debts have to be paid. That's why every minute was programmed, and reminds me a little bit of Mendel Weinbach. When you talked to him, you felt like you were the only thing that he was concentrating on. The instant the talk stopped, back in the sefer. It was back in the sefer. The sefer was open all the time. You could walk into the room and he wouldn't know that you were there. It was just if you had an appointment or you needed to speak to him, somehow his attention would be attracted. Otherwise, someone didn't attract his attention. It just was totally immersed in what he was doing. He answered questions for the public. Here's how it went. You take an envelope and you write on a piece of paper your question, and you enclose in the envelope a self-addressed postcard. And then he would write the answer to the postcard and it would go in the mail. That was to minimize the amount of time that he would have to take in answering you. He did not hesitate to say, I don't know. I had a question which bothered me, and one of the talmidim here was in correspondence with him. So I asked him to send in the question. In the Torah, you have lists of things, and there are vavs sometimes joining the list together, and the vavs are very irregular. You have a list of 4 things. You could have a vav between 1 and 2, or just between 3 and 4, or all 4, or 3 out of 4. Yeah, it was very irregular. So I wanted to know, how should I think about that? What should I understand with these variations? And he wrote back, Kimedumali Shavan Ezra Medaber al Zeh. Seems to me that the Even Ezra talks about it. He didn't give the place. Apparently, at the moment, he didn't remember exactly where it was. When I got that answer, I realized that I had been taught that Even Ezra. I had been taught it. I just forgotten it. That's all. Even Ezra on Chumash, right? Who talks in riddles most of the time, much of the time. Anyway, to know, to understand, he wrote Sfarim on areas that were not heavily traversed by other people. The sizes of things in rabbinic literature. He wrote a sefer on Chumash. There is a name that occurs twice in the Chumash, once with a vav and once without a vav. Turns out that the name with a vav occurs somewhere else in Tanakh, and the name without a vav occurs somewhere else in Tanakh. And where it is with a vav, the person is rich, whereas without a vav, the person is poor. So he, seeing it in the Chumash, remembered it from over there, and then he says, yeah, because this one has the vav, it's full, and therefore he's rich, and then without a vav, he's poor. He just writes it as a comment on, there was a very famous sage in Europe. Now, one was a Rogachev, and one was Meir Simcha. And one said about the other, I forget who said about who, one said about the other, he doesn't have a good memory. But it doesn't bother him because he's learned everything recently. Because he goes through his learning so many times, so rapidly, that he's learned everything recently. So he doesn't have to have a good long-term memory, because everything's short-term. People came to Reb Chaim from all walks of life. He was the Litvish Gadol, but more than that. In a certain sense, he was a Gadol in the eyes of the whole of the world. People looked up to him. People felt that if he's learning, the generation has a schus, has a merit. If he's davening, the generation has someone pleading on their behalf and caring about them. He belonged to Klal Yisrael in the best sense of that term, without compromising his particular Kabbalah, his Masorah, his tradition of his way of learning and his way of setting priorities for Jewish practice. But still, he was appreciated by everyone. There was a certain sense of there are good hands operating in the world. There are good hands operating because he's there. Because a year and a half ago, approximately, he got corona. The secular press went wild. The big rabbi has corona. These people don't believe in it, and they don't take precautions. And watch him suffer, and so on and so on. He didn't break his Cedar at all. He had it. He recovered, and he continued learning. Right? Nobody reported that. They didn't report that he recovered. No, they just were happy to see that he's vulnerable. Like just the crudity, the stupidity, and the low level on which they approach the world. 94 years old. He grew up in Europe. He came to Israel when he was 6 years old, and he went to the standard schools that were here at the time. And this absolute hasmada commitment. It's like people of prior times. Yeah.
What yeshivot did the Rav Tzal go to? Do you know maybe like which?
No, I don't know. I don't know which yeshivot he went to. It was standard. It's very interesting. They do say that most of the great scholars didn't go through the yeshiva system. They were taught by someone who saw their talent, and taught privately by his father, of course, disciple. But in his case, it seems that he did go through the standard. Well, what he did extra is extra, but he did go through the standard yeshiva system. I'll tell you a couple of stories about Rav Moshe Feinstein because I know them well, but they reflect on that total commitment. Someone came to see Rav Moshe when he was in his 80s, and the visitor was learning a certain subject and wanted to talk to Rav Moshe about it. And he mentioned the Tosfos, and he mentioned the daf on which the Tosfos is found. Moshe said, "You make a mistake. It's not on that daf. It's the next daf." So the visitor apologized and said, "Excuse me, Moshe, I'm only learning it now, so I have to know where it is." Meaning, I'm learning it now. I don't know the last time you learned it, and maybe you forgot. Moshe said, "Let's check." Where they were, there wasn't a shas. They had to go someplace and find the shas. Moshe was right. So the visitor said, "Why was it so important for you to check whether it was on this daf or that daf?" Moshe said, "If I ever forgot which daf a Tosfos was on, I could never paskin from memory again. I could never render a legal decision from memory. I'd have to look everything up." He was in his 80s. The standard was never to forget where something is. That's just, it's beyond belief. It's beyond belief. Traditionally we say the world is divided into 4 categories. There's inanimate things, there's vegetative growth and behavior, animals, and human beings. The Kuzari says there are 5, and for those of you who are watching, if this sounds prejudiced, it's prejudice in favor of the truth. The 5th one is the Jewish people, who are themselves a separate category. And in some circles, they say there's a 6th category, and that's the Talmid Chacham. The person who's a scholar like that, who really isn't part of the regular world. It's not part of the regular world. I started doing the Daf Yomi 45 years ago. I started Yevamot, so it means now I just finished my 6th cycle. Baruch Hashem. And I owe it to my first wife who pushed me into it. I had started 3 times, and I stopped. I couldn't continue it, and she somehow found the right way to motivate me, and that's why I was able to do it 6 times. I still pick up a piece of Gemara, and to me, it's as if I had never seen it. I've seen it 6 times before. I don't remember it. I just don't remember it, that's all. He finished Shas every year for decades. He had it all at his fingertips, and all the other things that he did. From time to time, I did learn some Yerushalmi. At one time, I did the Bavli and Yerushalmi together. But to remember it, to have it in front of you, to finish it every year, it's just beyond comprehension. Beyond comprehension. So we're talking about scholarship, and then people who take it upon themselves to criticize the scholars. They know better. They're smarter, they're cleverer. They have modern, independent methodologies which aren't prejudiced and so forth and so on. I just, the enormity of their intellectual mistake, the enormity of their intellectual crudity. I knew a fellow when I was in Boston, when I was in graduate school, and he told me that the Ramban is lenient in matters of monetary loss because he lived at a time and in a place where Jews were impoverished, were suffering from the poverty, and his heart bled for them, the bleeding heart liberal type, and that's why he felt bad for them, and that's why he was lenient in monetary matters. I said to him, "Oh, you mean there's no source in the entirety of Shas for it in strict legal terms? That's why it had to have been his psychological response to his environment? Do you know all of Shas? Have you looked at all of Shas? And all the other Rishonim in Shas? Rishonim that came before him? How could you say that it was psychological?" Easy, because if it's psychology and you read his psychology, you're a step above him. You know what he's doing better than he does. So he's now in your pocket. It's just gaiva and chutzpah, she'ein kamohu. I compare it to someone who would say, I know how Einstein thought of relativity. He lived in Vienna. In Vienna, there were lots of different cultural groups intermingling with one another. Everything was, he does it this way, he does it that way. So that's how he got to relativity. You can believe that about Einstein? No one would dare. Einstein was a great physicist. Must have been based on the deepest understanding of physical reality, which is true. Well, why do you think that the Ramban was any different? Because it's only religion, it's only Jews, and this guy, whom I'm talking about, was a shomer mitzvahs. He practiced Torah. But he's infected by this gigantic chutzpah. There's a fellow out there who says, here's the Gemara, here's what Rambam says, but Rambam didn't understand that Gemara. Gemara really meant something else. That's worse than trying to criticize Einstein. It's astonishingly stupid. Right? Here are these people whose scholarship is just you can just it's like squinting at a candle at the top of a mountain, seeing a little shine and thinking, I wonder what's up there. Yeah.
I have a question. So, Rav Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal, he came from a great yichus, great lineage, Stipler, and list of rabbis. In what way does the role of yichus play in a Gadol, in the becoming of a Gadol?
This is a very important question. What way does yichus play a role in becoming a Gadol? The Rabbi was once reciting his yichus, his lineage, and somebody said to him, I don't know what to say what you're doing. Either you're doing a good job or you're not doing a good job. If you're doing a good job, then you deserve credit for what you're doing. If you're not doing a good job, what is your great lineage going to help you? So he said, you don't understand. You come from fairly ordinary parents, grandparents. If you do something that's above average, you're already doing well, because you're stepping above what you were given. I recite my yichus to remind myself that no matter how well I'm doing, I'm not doing anything, because I got it all from them. When am I going to make a contribution? When am I going to do something? I have to work 10 times as hard as you in order to be able to say that I'm a success. I do it for humility. I do it as a challenge. Right? So there is no question that your lineage is important. And he certainly didn't hide his lineage and his debt to his lineage. But we know from his behavior the extraordinary effort that he made. And he and his familial circle, the women saw themselves as instrumental in their husband's success in Torah. And therefore they didn't allow anything to disturb their husband's success in Torah. Nothing. Even though the Rebbetzin, in her own right, was recognized, people came to her for brachos, and they came to her for advice how to live and how to develop and shidduchim and everything else. But her husband's learning was absolutely 100% to be the top priority, and therefore they get a great deal of. There's a Aruch HaShulchan who says they get more reward out of his learning than he does. Because there's a pasuk in Novi, which I don't remember, it says that a promise to the women, the promise to the women is greater than the promise to the men. So there is such an idea that they get a greater reward, and they see themselves as spiritual agents, and this is what they can contribute to this success of spirituality in the world, and they do it with enthusiasm. And you see there's something a little bit subtle going on here. It's not just that the woman makes it possible for the husband, but also he knows that that's what she's doing. So he knows that's how she looks at him. He knows that's what she expects from him. And living together and having a relationship, if you know what the other person expects from you, it's a motivation. It's a motivation to do it. To the extent that the wife of the Chazon Ish, at one point, asked him for a divorce. Why? Because she said, I married you to learn. I didn't marry to be mayor of Bnei Brak. because he had become involved. He wasn't mayor, but become involved with political issues in Bnei Brak, because the person who's responsible for a community, all parts of their activities are his responsibility, especially if he's a Das Torah, to apply Torah to all of their problems and all of their goals and all of their challenges is part of what he has to do. But her picture was, I married you to learn. And if you're not learning, so it had to be explained to her. I don't know how they resolved it eventually. But that was the idea, that it's not just that physically she makes it possible, but he knows. So the Gemara says, women by my zachin, what do they get merit in from their husband's learning? How do they get it? By waiting up for them till they come home. It means, I wanted to be there when you came home. I wanted to see you when you came home. I wanted to, share it with you. He knows he's coming home to that. Well, that's a large part of his motivation. At any rate, that family group includes Rabbi Yoshev, they had that kind of support, and their attachment to Torah was. And I think one of the articles that I saw put it very well. He was in love with the Torah. Amish in love with the Torah, and he wasn't in love with the Torah, Chas v'Sholem, as a kind of intellectual pursuit. And it's just very clever. When I first went to South Africa 41 years ago, I was told about a club that had existed there sometime before, a Talmud club. Refugees from Europe who once a week got together to study Talmud together because they wanted to do that. They came from all over the city. They lived in different places, came together and spent a few hours together learning Talmud every Saturday afternoon from all over the city. They didn't walk. They drove because they weren't keeping mitzvos. They just enjoyed Talmud. They enjoyed it. It has a certain intellectual flavor and it reminded them of home. And no, his love of Torah was love of what Kodesh Baruch Hu revealed to us. The Torah is a Kodesh Baruch Hu's ratzon. It's his plan for the world. So you're involving yourself in a connection with the Kodesh Baruch Hu via your intellect. Now you connect with the Kodesh Baruch Hu in a lot of ways, via your emotions, via your actions, values, but also via your intellect. That's what it was. It was love of a Kodesh Baruch Hu and love of his ratzon, which he revealed to us. And you'll have an experience of real love, and you'll see how you treasure every minute together with the person whom you love. You're never happier than when you're together with the person that you love. And someone like that, that's the way he feels about being together with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. He's never happier than when he's together with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. Yeah.
Just on the idea that learning Torah is pursuit for wisdom is frowned upon, or that's not should be the reason learning Torah is to have more wisdom. But is learning Torah directly related to observance, or because why couldn't those Yidden that were in South Africa wanted to connect to Hashem? That's how they felt they were connecting to Hashem, was through the Torah. Maybe they didn't feel it through Shabbos, or how could we assume that they didn't? Those were their intentions.
Okay, there are several things going on in your question. First of all, the idea of learning Torah in order to acquire wisdom, that might be all right. It might be all right. I'll tell you something what the Nefesh Chaim says, which I think is very... You hear this, you'll hear how easy it is to be superficial and how difficult it is to be deep. Is it appropriate to serve a Kodesh Baruch Hu in order to get reward in the world to come? So, okay, you shake your head. That's not bad. The way you respond. On the one hand, it's certainly valid. The Kodesh Baruch Hu does promise the world to come, and if he promises a reward, it's supposed to motivate us. So it's okay. But on the other hand, it's selfish, because it's my reward that I'm going to get for myself. It's not noble. Nobility would be to do it because it's right, because I love a Kodesh Baruch Hu and I want to do what he wants to do, right? And Chaim says, yeah, but even desire for the world to come could be understood that way. If your attitude is, I'm doing this to get to the world to come because He wants me in the world to come. He wants me there. He created me that I should be there. It says He wants me there. That's why I want to get there, because He wants it. Then it's not selfish anymore. Not selfish anymore. So now he has wisdom. Well, if I want to be thought of as clever, or I want to have the satisfaction that I'm using my intellect well, that's going to be very selfish. But I'm supposed to say to myself, because Baruch Hu wants me to be wise. He wants me to be wise. He told me to acquire wisdom. So I'm going after the wisdom because He wants me to be that way. Then that's fine. That's top of the line. So it all depends upon now, your second part of your question raises a different kind of issue. Maybe those people who drove on Saturday afternoon to get together to learn Talmud didn't feel connected to Kodesh Baruch Hu through Shabbos, and they did feel connected to Kodesh Baruch Hu through the study of Torah. So why are we so quick to condemn them? I'll tell you why. I didn't say this before, but I'll tell you why now. Because feeling connected is not the criterion. Being connected is the criterion. We're not into fantasies. We're not into dreams. We're not into hallucinations. We're not into taking a drug and feeling self-transcended. Sorry. So if you don't feel connected and you do feel connected by the study, you're not connecting to Kodesh Baruch Hu because He wants you to keep Shabbos. So you're saying that you're connecting to Him is a lie. And if you're basing yourself only on your feelings without any objective reference, sorry. It reminds me of a study that was done 40 or 50 years ago on marijuana. They took people who were creative artists and poets and musicians, and these people used marijuana, and they used it for some period of time. And then they went through a couple of weeks of artistic creativity and created whatever they did, each one in his own field. And they evaluated it. Then they put it away, and they had them, they volunteered for this, stop using marijuana for a year, how long it was. And then they came back and they showed them the things that they had created during that period of time and asked them to evaluate them. Evaluations were utterly different. While they were under the marijuana, they thought they had done terrific work. And a year later, they thought it was junk. Because not only did the marijuana give them the false illusion of being creative, but also it gave them the inability to objectively evaluate what they had produced. Right? So feelings just as feelings is not what Yiddishkeit is about. Now here, it's a very deep, there's lots and lots of implications. Without the objective backing of drugs is one example. People will tell you, I feel perfectly healthy, even though I don't do any exercise and I don't eat well and so forth and so on, but I feel fine. I say, well, then your feelings are not revealing to you how your body's deteriorating. Sorry! Because you aren't really healthy, no matter how you feel. You aren't healthy. So it's not a question of evaluating their feelings. It's a question of what they're connecting to really. Not really connecting to Kodesh Baruch Hu. They think they're connecting, it makes it in a certain sense even worse. If it's just an intellectual pastime, that's at least more realistic. Yeah.
Is there any way at all to fill the void of our loss of time?
I think not. I want to tell you something now, which I believe I read it from Rav Chaim Shmulevitz. It's a very interesting Chazal, very interesting Rashi. 3 times in the Torah it says Be'etzem Yom Hazeh. Be'etzem Yom Hazeh can mean noontime. It means the clarity of the day, the brightest part of the day. Once is when Kodesh Baruch Hu tells Noach to go into the ark from the flood, to avoid the flood. And the Midrash says, the people said to Noach, you're building this boat, right? Because you think there's going to be a flood? You're not going to escape the flood. We won't let you get on. There's going to be a flood, you're going to drown with us. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, I want you to go don't sneak in the midnight when everybody's sleeping. No, go right in the middle of the day. Let's see them stop you. I'm telling you to go, they won't stop you. Same thing with the Exodus. Egypt had the reputation that slaves never escape. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, let's see. I want you to leave at a time when everybody's on board. There's a full moon, so there's a period of minutes where the sun and the moon are both visible, where the sun is up and the moon is up, right? The moon is going down, the sun is coming up. The moon is visible, the sun is visible. Let's see them stop you. In the middle of the day. The brightest part of the day, Exodus took place also. The third time is when, because Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu, climb Har Nevo, you're going to die there. Go up, be'etzim hayom. So Rashi, on that verse, brings the other two and says, and because Baruch Hu said the same thing here. Moshe, go up, the brightest part of the day. They're going to say, we won't let it happen. Let's see them stop me. So Chaim says, we understand the people of the generation of the flood, how they could say, we'll stop you over the sword. We understand the Egyptians, who could say to the Jews, you're never going to escape because no one escapes. But here, other Jews are going to say that we'll prevent losing Moses. I mean, how are they going to do that? Right? These are people who spent 40 years in the wilderness. They saw all the miracles. What are they going to do? Chaim always explains it like this. Because Baruch Hu has a principle that if the generation really needs the leader, he won't die. That's because Baruch Hu's principle. And he said, I know what's going to happen. When I want to take him from the world, you're going to say, we can't live without him. This man who split the sea for us, this man who fed us and caused the manna to fall in the wilderness, we cannot live without him. And then you're going to invoke my principle that if you really need him, I can't take him. Because Baruch Hu says, I'm putting this in my terms now, but it's his thought. And Baruch Hu says, I'm not a prisoner of my own principles. Yes, I have a principle that if you need him, if he's needed, I won't take him. And this time I'm taking him anyway. This time I'm taking him anyway. So I thought to myself, when I read that, so what does that mean every time we have a loss? We have a loss, it means we can't relate to that leader anymore. We can't relate to him. And therefore, he's vulnerable. Therefore, he can be taken from the world. I have another proof for it. Because it says when Moshe Rabbeinu was on Har Sinai, and the people make the golden calf, and because Baruch Hu says to him, Lech reik yishich esamcha, go down because your people has become corrupt. And Chazal say, Rei migduloscha, go down from your greatness, because the greatness I gave you was only for their sake. And now that they can't relate to it, they can't be inspired by it or learn from it, you lose it. I didn't give it to you because you made a big effort. I gave it to you as a means by which you could inspire and elevate them. And if they can't get it, so that's one thing. He loses his greatness, but he can be taken from the world also. If there's nothing, if you can't relate to him, so then you don't deserve him. So now you ask, what can we do to fill the void? Nothing we can do to fill the void, but we could try to preserve the presence in the world of the leaders who are alive by relating to them, by receiving from them, learning from them, their inspiration, their guidance, their psak halacha, so as to make a contribution to their continuing leadership in the world. And I will say one more thing, then I'll take a question. I think this is right. It may sound to some people like a bit of a chutzpah, but after a person leaves the world physically, any mitzvos that they motivate in people who remain behind counts to their merit. So if you can say, here's something which I was thinking of doing, I'm not doing it consistently, I want Reb Chaim to have merit. He gave us so much. His presence, his example, his inspiration, his writings, he gave us so much. I want to give something back. So I'm going to do something extra I otherwise wouldn't do. And I'm going to do it for him. I'm going to do it in his name. I'm going to do it, say I'm doing this because he inspired us, and I want to pay something back. That will be an extra schus for him. Now, some person is going to say, his schus is measured in numbers is 1 trillion. And the amount that you're going to pay back is, 0.0001% of 1. Okay, so what? So what? There's a person in the world who said, because Chaim was here, because I was mekabel so much from him, I want to give something back. I think that's worth something. worth something to him. It's worth something to his neshama. So that's something that could be done also. Yeah, you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I wanted to say, like, by void, and that like when a person learns Torah, they bring light into the world. So, like, you said how we finish Kol Torah Kula every year. So now we don't have that. So now there's this whole void of all that light that was supposed to be coming in. So aren't we, like, in darkness now? Like,
Yes, no question about it.
so how do we, like, come out of that? How do we?
Well, I think part of the answer is that maybe you don't come out of it. You have to learn to live with more darkness. Let me give you a brutal example. We had prophecy, common prophecy for 1,000 years. That was 2,500 years ago. We didn't come out of that. We learned to live without prophecy.
This is the real Yerida Hadoros.
That's right. Exactly. This is Yerida Hadoros. Exactly. Yeah.
Rob, would it be an unhealthy approach to see the sudden passing of Rav Kanievsky's Zatzal as a punishment from Hashem?
I don't think you can call it sudden. He was 94 years old. He was getting weaker. He got weaker over the last several months.
Wasn't it a shock?
I'm sorry?
It wasn't a shock. I felt like it was a shock.
You know, there are levels and levels. There's a difference between someone getting killed in an automobile accident when he's 35 versus, let's say, your own parent. You never, even the parent's sick and so on, you never really are psychologically prepared for the person's passing. For a child, it's a life-altering event. So I don't think that really prepared. You know, it's like the sun going out. I mean, you prepared for the sun to go out. He was so extraordinarily outstanding that. You see, I don't know his life as that well, but Chaim Kanievsky, Avram Kanievsky, he was also one he was also followed the Chazon Ish. I'll just tell you two stories about him, because these kinds of stories aren't the ones that make the headlines. There was a fire in his area where he lived, and a number of the apartments were gutted and so on. While the fire was going on, he was writing out ksubas, because a man and wife are not allowed to live together if she doesn't have her ksuba. And in some cases, the ksubas got burned up. And while they're busy with the fire department, with the insurance, with the police, and everything else, will they think by nightfall to have a ksuba? So he wrote out, of course, from memory, wrote out ksubas for these people and gave them to them. They should have the ksubas. Another thing, in the next door apartment, he heard a child crying. Now, what had happened was, the parents left the child, maybe it was 4 years old. Child left him home asleep, and they both went out, shopping, whatever it was. They locked the door, and he woke up. He's all alone. He was afraid. So Chaim went up, and he tried to open the door. Couldn't open the door. He got a ladder. He climbed up to the second floor on the ladder, called the child over the window, and told him stories until the parent came home. I'll tell you one more story about him. Just to get a sense of who these people are. There was one boy who was in Cedar. How old was he? Maybe, let's say 8. Not sure, but about 8. And was not doing well. It was a behavior problem. They took him to a doctor. The doctor said he has ADD or ADHD, and you got to give him this medication, and maybe he could take Cedar for a half hour, an hour, but no more, because he can't take it. Half hour, 8-year-old. What's going to become of him? So the parents came to Rav Kanievsky. So he said, bring the child to me. Brought the child in. And Rav Kanievsky said to him, what do you like to do? I like to play this game. Oh, you like to play that game? Let's play. Kanievsky got down on the floor with the kid, sat down on the floor with him, played the game with him. Half hour. Then Rav Kanievsky says, you know, I enjoyed playing the game with you, but I have other things to do, and you have other things to do also. So you need to learn the Cheder, but I want you to do me a favor. I want you to help me with the kids in your class. I'm going to give you a question. I'll give you the answer. And you ask it to the kids in the class. And the ones who get the right answer will get a present from me. You bring them to me, and I'll give them prizes. Wow, he's now the star. He's the star. He goes to Rabbi Kanievsky and he comes back with questions, and then he asks the question, you get the right answer, he takes you there, and you get your prize. Oh, he's the star of the class. He sat there and he learned, and he got used to it, and he returned to full-time learning. That's not genius. That's not caring, climbing into the kid's situation, sitting on the floor with him, playing a game with him. So you read stories. Oh yes, and I forget, here's another one that I read. There was a Rosh Yeshiva, and he was told by one boy, there's another boy who in the evenings goes out of the yeshiva and goes and does various things that aren't appropriate. This was winter time. So the Rosh Yeshiva said to the informant, tell me next time he leaves. Tell me as soon as he leaves. So he did. Rosh Yeshiva grabs his overcoat and goes and catches the boy who's leaving and says, it's cold. Here, take my coat. He's leaving the yeshiva, going to do illicit things. The Rosh Yeshiva says, take my coat, it's cold. Can you imagine that? Put yourself in the footsteps of the kid. He knows what he's doing is wrong. He knows he's cheating. The Rosh Yeshiva just wants him to be warm, that's all. He said later that saved him. So these people talk about, the Gadol being out of touch in the ivory tower and so on and so on. Absolutely not. They're responsible for communities of people, responsible for families, responsible for social policy. This gives just an example of the kinds of people that we're talking about. We lost someone very, very great. Very great. And Kodesh Baruch Hu should have rachamim on us and enable us, the others who are left, to lead us in the ways that will help us serve him better.